they wouldn't rent to black people. And this was in the 60s, and they were sued by the Justice Department under the Civil Rights Act. They absolutely had evidence, right? Because they literally had lists of people who had applied, and they would write a C by the people who were black. This idea that the right wing could be a powerful force in American life has been disproven for all time.
We're pleased to be joined by Rick Perlstein, a historian, journalist, and author of numerous books like Nixonland, Reaganland on right-wing politics, various topics. And I want to start by thanking you so much for joining us today and speaking with us.
Yeah, looking forward to talking.
Yeah, the pleasure's all of ours. And I want to start kind of with the question of Trump. I'm sure having
Mhm.
studied kind of contemporary Republican politics,
Yeah.
I'm curious from your opinion, is the sort of like Trumpian politics something that
Uh-huh.
we should have seen coming, or is it kind of unique to Trump where he's broken from conservatives of old?
I mean, that is like such the best possible question. It's such a colossal, huge question because it's almost like it gets you to the first day of History 101,
Yep.
where your professor says history is the study of continuity and change,
Hmm.
right? Because it's a classic both and situation. With Trump, there's a similar kind of meeting of very unusual circumstances of his individual biography that makes him kind of rhyme with the movement we're in that's been coming about for a very long time. One is that he grew up with a certain kind of father, right, who was, domineering and he was the second son, and the first son was a disappointment, so he really felt like he had to be everything his dad wanted him to be. His dad was, a sadist and a slumlord, basically, and um a racist. His dad had been the Ku Klux Klan, so so you got to look at the Ku Klux Klan. Where does that come from, right?
Yeah.
But there's a certain kind of reactionary energy that came out of white people in the outer boroughs of New York in the 1960s and 70s, right? And I talk about this in my book Nixonland. Uh, but he became a business partner of his dad, who had massive real estate developments subsidized by the government, right? As housing was in the middle of the 20th century, and they wouldn't rent to black people. And this was in the 60s, and they were sued by the Justice Department under the Civil Rights Act. They absolutely had evidence, right? Because they literally had lists of people who had applied, and they would write a C by the people who were black, and they never got apartments. It was proven. So the answer is definitely both. And, it'll be a long time before we can truly figure it out because, right now we're just fighting for our lives.
I'm curious because with the way now, obviously, how the kind of Trump politics have taken over, like you're either with Trump or you're not a Republican
Yes.
at this point. I'm curious, so in my opinion, what I've always attributed it to was kind of after George Bush with like the fallout with the Iraq war lies and stuff,
Yeah.
Republicans kind of without an identity, Trump kind
Yeah.
of swooped in, perfect timing. I'm curious from
That's a
your
really good way of putting it. Yeah.
yeah, so I was just gonna kind of lay it to you then,
Yeah.
even maybe farther back historically, or if you think that
Right.
was a good point, what kind of allowed the shift within the party to allow like
Yeah.
a Trump to take it over?
Well, so first of all, um, the biggest aperture is the subject of my historical expertise, which is how this right-wing faction of the Republican Party that has always been a part of it,
Mhm.
right? We talked about Joe McCarthy, the Ku Klux Klan would have been, kind of part of it. Um, Basically took over the party, right?
Mhm.
And that's a whole fascinating, complicated story that has to do with kind of the first book I wrote was about how this guy Barry Goldwater became the nominee because conservatives can be very, very ruthless and very good at manipulating the institutions. They basically were able to I don't want to say steal the nomination, but through a lot of cunning, get him the nomination, and then he won this colossal loss. I mean, he didn't,
Oh,
he suffered this colossal loss, and everyone's like, this idea that the right wing could be a powerful force in American life has been disproven for all time.
yep,
And then, basically my next book is like it's called the one called Dixieland. It's like the 60s happened, right?
yep.
And all these crazy social movements that made, kind of middle Americans, middle class white male Americans especially, really fearful, and they adopted just the kind of policies that Barry they had rejected at a more confident time when Barry Goldwater was running. But the other part of it that's internal to the Republican Party is the party itself has kind of become progressively more authoritarian here, right? So even though, you know, George W. Bush was a lot more of a rule follower and was a lot closer to the kind of responsible adults in the room in the Republican Party, the establishment, through his father, right? So that's kind of a paradox right there, right? Oh, on the one hand, he's part of this, kind of he comes out of this, and his grandfather, who was a senator, right? So he comes out of, kind of good breeding, right?
Yeah.
The civilized world, right? And yet at the same time, we're supposed to celebrate that this guy is basically a scion of a aristocratic family, right? That's not very liberal, right? So he, on the one hand, kind of does things within the institutions a little bit more than we've seen Donald Trump, but in a lot of ways, he was lawless, right? The way he started the Iraq War, and he was backed by some very vicious politicking based on a politics of hate that we associate with Donald Trump. So, because Republicans tend to become more and more authoritarian as a party, we still can look back at him nostalgically, just like during his outrages, people look back at Reagan nostalgically, and after during Reagan's outrages, people look back at Barry Goldwater,
Mhm.
nostalgically. So that's kind of the basic outline of the Republican Party. But then you get into what happens after the Iraq War, what happens after the financial crisis, and yeah, there really is this power vacuum because suddenly Bush, who was really treated, in this almost like a king-like way by Republicans, they suddenly, cut him loose, right? And he was seen as a pariah in the party, and there was a space for this new movement, the Tea Party, right? Which has, connections to this guy who actually, around the time of the Tea Party, Donald Trump really started inserting himself to politics. There was rumors he was going to run in 2012, right? But yeah, by 2016 you have two kind of establishment Republican candidates, John McCain, the senator, and Mitt Romney, who had been the governor from Massachusetts. Both of them had kind of moderate components to their image. And there was this very interesting thing that happened in the Republican Party after Romney lost, which meant they lost two presidential elections in a row to this, supposedly liberal, but it turns out not really liberal black guy, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
complication too. I mean, my book that I'm writing about this is called The Infernal Triangle because I think the media and the Democratic Party played just as important role in kind of, failing us and bringing to this movement. So presidential victory is always won with coalitions, but again, this theme of kind of the man meeting his movement, and then this institution of the Republican Party kind of hollowed out. Nothing had worked before, and both its mostly its voters, right? Not so much its leaders, who were obviously very skeptical of Donald Trump when he entered the scene until he started winning.
Mhm.
That's where the authoritarianism comes in, you know. Um, they say, yeah, they exercise their prerogative, in this semi-democratic society, and next thing you know, you have a pattern that we see with kind of right-wing demagogues, all across the 20th century.
Yeah, and I'm curious then because we've seen obviously Trump 1, which was pretty authoritarian in its own right. There's Trump
Right.
2 with what we've already seen 9 months in. Um,
Yeah.
do you think like when the word like fascism gets thrown
Mhm.
around, is that something
Yeah.
you consider historically accurate, categorically accurate to describe Trump, or do you think that
Yeah.
this is the mark?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question too. You're asking all the right ones. I mean, these are public arguments, and I've planted my flag on team fascism, right? So
Mhm.
I was like probably the first guy in the fall of early fall, might have even been summer of 2015, to write an article considering whether Trump was a fascist or his movement was fascist. And I kind of at that point, answered no because da 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 da.
Mhm.
But now I'm very much on team fascism. And, there are both historical reasons, and it obviously is very related to how you define fascism, right? If you think it was the product of certain historical alignments in the early 20th century that we don't share now. For example, the 20th century had in Europe had a very strong communist movement, right?
Mhm.
Um, then you'll say no, right? If you um, think of fascism in a kind of a more qualitative way, as I do, as kind of what happens in a modern media-driven society with somewhat democratic politics when you have a very alienated populace, right?
Mhm.
And it's basically an attempt to go back to both, a myth about the past, but also something that's true about the past, which is that basically you had strong leaders who dictated in a very hierarchical top-down way what ordinary people can do, and that's relieving them of the burden of freedom and just the belief that having a strong guy in which everyone knows what's what is just much more soul satisfying for people who are frightened, right? And that, except for they're doing this old thing, they want to go back to this old thing, but they're using the very modern methods of mass media persuasion, right? The definition of reality, the distortion of reality, right? Which is a super important part of studying Nazi Germany, right?
Mhm.
Um, if you think that's what fascism is all about, right? You say, yeah. I mean, especially for me, the most important part of why only the word fascism, that fact saying the word fascism does work and helps people understand things and also understands their historical obligations in a way no other word does, right? Like say conservative or even reactionary or populist, right?
Yeah.
Fascist, um, to me, most profoundly means the utter hijacking of reality by kind of mass media myth.